World War II. A struggle in which 70 million people died. A huge hurricane affecting the whole world. Dozens of countries destroyed by desires? A wreckage left behind by tank pallets. World War II in 30 minutes. World War II. There are countless events that we can call important in history, but none of them left a trace on humanity as much as the Second World War did. This week, we will tell you the main lines of World War II so that everyone can have a more comfortable place in their minds. Totalitarian and fascist regimes became increasingly popular in Europe after the Great War. The sociological depression caused by the 1929 economic crisis also put the world in a pessimistic atmosphere. Hitler, who took the helm of Germany in such an environment, tried very hard to compensate for the heavy losses his country suffered in the First World War. He re-established the broken order and became stronger. He set the policy of reunification of German minorities living outside the borders of the country under the domination of Germany and the colonization of new lands and the settlement of the German population in these lands as his target. The idea of living space, namely Lebensraum, drove him to an aggressive foreign policy. He saw this policy as indispensable for the redevelopment of his country and people. Adolf Hitler did not intend to start a world war while developing his country. The events of the First World War were more fresh in the memory of both the people and the army, and no one even thought of the idea of a new war. Despite this, Adolf did not refrain from doing things that would cause reaction in the international arena. He captured the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland in 1936, sent troops into the Spanish Civil War, annexed Austria in 1938, and pressed Czechoslovakia for the Sudetenland to get what it wanted. These bloodless and easy successes of Hitler made him more and more demanding. While Germany was turning into a monster that swallowed everything that came its way, the British and the French either ran away from the problems or put the problems on the shelf instead of stopping Hitler. With the solicitation policy they implemented, they made concessions to the Germans. Encouraged by the concessions given to him, the Germans rolled up their sleeves to go further. They annexed Czechoslovakia in March 1939. In the south, the Italians invaded Albania under the leadership of fascist and expansionist Benito Mussolini. These two invading states signed the Steel Pact in May and became allies. Shocked by Hitler's annexation of Czechoslovakia, the British and French tried to stop him, but it was too late. Hitler had already made all the plans for his new target, the invasion of Poland. Germany and the Soviet Union on August 23, they signed a non-aggression pact, which divided Lithuania, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia between them. On September 1, 1939, the Germans began their invasion of Poland. A few days later, France and England declared war on Nazi Germany as allies and tried to blockade the enemy country from the sea. At that time, the Germans were invading Poland from the west and the Russians from the east. By October, the occupation of the Polish lands was completed. You can watch the detailed video about the invasion of Poland by clicking the card on the top right. Undoubtedly, there are many points of interest about World War II. There are countless interesting data about the powers of the parties, the characteristics of the weapons they use, and the battles. As the channel, we try to visualize this seemingly complex information and convey it to you on the map. Or we are trying to direct you to such content. In this direction, we strongly recommend the Second World War infographic book, which is one of the most wonderful ways of data visualization. You can be sure that this work, which came out of the Chronicle, is the most valuable work we have ever recommended. From the sales and properties of the tanks used in the war, to the oil reserves of the countries, you can find many statistics that you can think of, from losses in battles to the number of prisoners in captive containers, from manpower costs to combat losses, in a visualized way. We would like to thank the Chronicle book that prepared this work, which we admired and examined for weeks, as the channel admins. And we recommend that you add this hardcover and color special edition to your library. You can get this work, which has been offered to your liking with a special price for the first edition, so that anyone who is interested in World War II can get it by clicking the link below. We will pause for a few seconds and continue our video so that you can click on the link and examine the work. Germany decided to invade France in order to impose their occupation and force the British to make peace. But the season had turned to winter and it was necessary to wait a little. The Russians, on the other hand, put pressure on the Scandinavian countries in accordance with the agreement they signed with the Germans. When Finland did not succumb to this pressure, the Winter War began in November 1939. The Finns withstood far more powerful than themselves against the Russians. By the end of the war in March 1940, the Soviet armies were able to seize much less land than expected. You can watch the video about the Winter War by clicking on the card in the upper right in the same way. The Soviet Union, following the war with the Finns, it occupied the Bessarabia and Bukovina regions of Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Romania. In the spring of 1940, the Allies tried to block the Iron Corridor between Sweden and Germany. Hitler embarked on the invasion of Denmark and Norway to protect the flow of iron. He would invade these two countries in a short time. But Hitler's main focus was the invasion of France. He gave the necessary order on May 10, 1940. The German army, the Wehrmacht, surprisingly advanced tanks from the Ardennes region, contrary to Allied forecasts. Perfectly using the Blitzkrieg tactic, he reached the English Channel and trapped large numbers of enemy soldiers in the Dunkirk pocket. Trapped due to disagreements in the German command or Hitler's tolerance of the British, the soldiers were evacuated by sea. While the Wehrmacht was successfully occupying, on June 10, Italy declared war on France and attacked. By the middle of the month, the Germans had captured most of France. They had established the Vichy government attached to them in the region they did not capture. As the German and British navies clashed in the Atlantic Ocean, Hitler considered attacking the British Isles to force the British into peace. The Luftwaffe started bombing British cities in July. But the British Royal Air Force was not defeated. Both as a result of this and as the direction of the war began to change, the Germans cancelled Operation Sea Lion, which was an attempt to land on the island. In September 1940, the Axis Powers Alliance was formed when Japan sided with Germany and Italy. The alliance was strengthened with the participation of Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania. An opportunity arose for Mussolini in the Mediterranean as Hitler descended like a dark cloud over the island of Britain. Italian armies attacked British-held Egypt on September 13th, and Greece on October 28th, which they accused of allying with the British. Both of these attempts were unsuccessful. The Greeks resisted with unexpected stubbornness and stopped the Italian invasion. In North Africa, the situation was worse. The British resisted the onslaught from the Italians and by February 1941 captured the entire Cyrenaica region. It was the British government's change of strategy that saved the Italians. After the success at Cyrenaica, most of the troops there were shifted to Greece. Adolf Hitler intervened when Mussolini messed things up and the British posed a threat to Romanian oil via Greece. He established the German North Africa Corps in Libya. In the Balkans, he included Bulgaria on March 1st and Yugoslavia on March 25th into the Axis alliance. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. General Dusan Simovic came to power after a coup in Yugoslavia and announced that he was leaving the Axis powers. Thereupon, Hitler started preparations for an operation that included the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. Erwin Rommel, the commander of the forces in Africa, launched an attack on March 31st and took all the places lost by the Italians in a short time and reached the Egyptian border. Success suddenly increased the importance of this secondary front. The Germans could continue their success and reach Middle East oil via Egypt. Wanting to prevent this, the British immediately reinforced the front. This would increase the heat of the war in Libya and Egypt. You can watch the detailed content about the North African front of the war by clicking the card in the upper right in the same way. The Balkan campaign started on April 6. While the German Second Army entered Belgrade and disabled Yugoslavia on April 17, the 12th Army entered Greece and forced the country to surrender on April 22. The British soldiers barely retreated to the island of Crete. The Germans carried out one of the most daring and interesting operations of the war and made an aerial landing on the island of Crete on May 20. They captured the island, albeit with great loss. After the completion of the Balkan campaign, Hitler set his sights on one of his main targets, Russia. Hitler did not trust for many reasons the Soviet Union, which he had been grinding for a long time. He had decided long ago to attack in order to break the last hope of the British and have them sign peace. Although the Balkan campaign delayed this plan a bit, the German armies organized the Barbarossa operation and began to invade Russia on June 22, 1941. Other Axis powers and Finland also participated in this operation. At the beginning of the operation, the Germans had achieved most of their targets, marching non-stop and advancing hundreds of kilometers. The British, somewhat relieved as their enemies shifted their power eastward, made an alliance with the Russians. They achieved dominance in the Middle East and secured Iranian oil together with the Russians in August. Despite these measures, the panzers never stopped. They were advancing on the Russian plains as if they were crushing those in front of them. By September, all targets were achieved except Leningrad in the north and Sivasspol in the south. Hitler launched Operation Typhoon on September 30th and demanded an attack on Moscow. Although the Wehrmacht occupied a large area, it was stopped on November 25th, 30 km from the city. The Germans were exhausted. In addition, both human resources have decreased and raw material requirements have reached an extreme. The Russians, on the other hand, had stopped the enemy in front of the capital despite all the defeats and losses. With the strength they gathered inland and the support of their allies, they were preparing to counterattack. The Allies' first offensive came from North Africa. The British attacked the Axis troops in Operation Crusader on November 18 and successfully drove them back by the end of December. On December 5, the Russian counterattack began in front of Moscow. Shocked by the attack and the advantage it gave them in the winter, the Red Army pushed the Wehrmacht back between 150 kilometers and 300 kilometers. However, he could not get his enemies out of Russian soil in the attacks that would last until April 1942. With heavy losses, the Soviet leaders understood that the Germans would stubbornly hold on to Russian soil. A short time after the start of the offensive on both fronts, a great event took place far away that would change the course of the war. In the Far East, Japan had been pursuing an expansionist policy since the 1930s. For this purpose, he attacked Manchuria and China and coveted some colonies of European states. So there was a war already existing in the Pacific. As a member of the Axis powers in line with its interests, Japan faced an oil embargo from European states when it continued its aggressive policy. Considering this as a de facto declaration of war, he took strength from Germany's achievements and set out to prevent the USA and other states from blocking his own path. He launched the Pearl Harbor raid on December 7, 1941 to destroy the U.S. fleet he thought would attack him. Thus, the USA, eager to enter the war, landed on the field and the Pacific front of World War II was opened. You can watch the detailed video about the Pearl Harbor raid on the card in the upper right. Although U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt immediately declared war on the Axis powers, his country was shaken after the raid. The Americans needed some time to form public opinion in domestic politics and enter the war. Japan, on the other hand, took action quickly with the relief of having their enemy out of the way. He attacked the colonies held by the Allied powers in December. Hong Kong began his invasion of the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. By May 1942 it occupied most of the places mentioned. It even bombed some enemy ships anchored in Australian ports. The easy success of the Japanese at sea helped them increase their self-confidence in a short time. The Americans needed some time to form public opinion in domestic politics and enter the war. Japan, on the other hand, took action quickly with the relief of having their enemy out of the way. He attacked the colonies held by the Allied powers in December. Hong Kong began his invasion of the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. By May 1942, it occupied most of the places mentioned. It even bombed some enemy ships anchored in Australian ports. The easy success of the Japanese at sea helped them increase their self-confidence in a short time. Clinging to Russian territory, the Germans decided to launch another offensive in May 1942. They had stopped the Russian counterattack and their forces were still in place. Hitler was convinced that wheat and oil in the Caucasus were needed to continue the war. On the other hand, he was also eager to bring down Leningrad. Therefore, the attack to be made in the spring was not to be made from the center on Moscow, but from the flanks to Leningrad and Stalingrad. The operation, which the Axis powers called the Blue Situation, began in June. At the end of August, the Wehrmacht headed for Stalingrad on the Volga River and entered the interior of the Caucasus after securing the Crimean Peninsula. Erwin Rommel was blowing in North Africa during the Battle of Stalingrad. Returning to where he started, the general launched a new attack at the beginning of 1942. He defeated the British in front of Gazela, took Tobruk, and reached El Alamein in June. This and the advance on the Eastern Front constituted the most extreme point the Axis had reached in the war. The African Panzer Army, which was trying to defeat the British in Egypt and reach the Middle East oil, lost all of its combat power in the Second Battle of El Alamein. Rommel withdrew from a large area in November, ignoring Hitler's orders. Because the Allied forces, including the US forces, had landed from Morocco and Algeria with Operation Torch on November 8th. The landing forces were growing in numbers and the troops were advancing towards Tunisia. The Axis powers in Africa were trying to retreat with unprecedented speed so as not to be caught between two fires. In its finale, the Germans invaded southern France under the Vichy government, while some government officials burned the French fleet to keep it from falling into German hands. For the Germans, things were getting worse on all fronts. At the time of the defeat in North Africa, the Russians were also preparing for a new attack. After showing great resistance in Stalingrad, they started the Uranus operation on November 19th with the forces they prepared in the Ural Mountains. In a day or two, they surrounded the German 6th Army in Stalingrad. Although Operation Winterstorm was carried out in December to save the 6th Army, the attempt was not successful. The Russians embarked on Operation Little Saturn to encircle the enemy's southern army. As the German armies retreated to the west of the Don River at the end of January 1943, the surviving soldiers in Stalingrad surrendered. The war in the Pacific was also changing direction. Japan had reached its goal of Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Area in 4 months, but nothing was over yet. They had to prevent the US from returning to the Pacific again. On the one hand, the Japanese, advancing in China, took action to cut the link between the USA and Australia. The Battle of the Coral Sea took place between the United States and Japan in May 1942. Although the Japanese prevailed tactically in the battle, strategically the Americans were victorious and repulsed their enemy by the ferry. As a second step, the Japanese planned to take Midway Island and bring the US Navy into the war and destroy the enemy's aircraft carriers. As a result of this thought, the Battle of Midway took place at the beginning of June. This battle was a turning point for the Pacific Front. While the victory remained in the United States, the Japanese lost a significant portion of their air and naval forces. Afterwards, the Americans attacked the Solomon Islands, where Japan's third main line of defense is located. The Battle of Guadalcanal, which began in August, ended in February 1943, and the area fell to the Allies. British attacks against Arakan and Burma were unsuccessful. The year 1943 brought with it the fall of the Axis. Having survived the siege, the German army in Africa retreated to Tunisia, which still did not fall, and tried to resist at this bridgehead. The Axis also strengthened Tunisia as much as possible, as the Allies saw it as a jumping-off point to Europe. After months of relentless fighting, the Axis forces could not stand it any longer, and they withdrew from Africa in May, giving more than 100,000 prisoners. Thus, the Allies had the opportunity to cross into Europe. The Allies were obviously going to land in Europe. But where that would come from was confusing. There was the possibility of an attack coming from any point from the English Channel to the Greek coast. In addition, the relationship between the Italians and the Germans, who lost their best men in Tunisia, also deteriorated. Mussolini needed German help to protect his country, but he also feared Hitler's domination over Italy. Having completed their work in Africa, Allied troops were then preparing to land 500,000 soldiers in Sicily in Operation Husky. When the preparations were completed in July, the landing began. While the war continued on the island, the opposition in Italy overthrew Mussolini. As the newly formed government tried to sit down at the peace table with the Allies, the leader of Germany rolled up his sleeves to free Mussolini from captivity. American and British soldiers, on the other hand, were successful and captured the island completely in August, although the Axis forces pulled men from the Eastern Front and strengthened the defense. Especially the Italians suffered great losses in the conflicts in Sicily. On September 3rd, the Allies landed at the tip of the Italian boot. 5 days later, when the new Italian government announced its withdrawal from the war, the Nazis launched Operation Axe, capturing important Italian positions and disarming the Italian army. While the American and British troops were advancing rapidly, Hitler, on the advice of his commanders, considered retreating to the Alps and making a defense. But when General Albert Kesselring stopped the Allies south of Rome in October, he changed his mind. Despite fighting on other fronts, Hitler decided to fortify and defend Italy. Although the Allies attacked the defense line in Italy many times as of November, they were not successful and experienced great disappointment. The German defenses in Italy would not be breached in any way until May 1944. If you want, let's go back to the Eastern Front, which we left after Stalingrad. As a result of the Stalingrad defeat and the repression of the Russians in 1943, the German Army Group A retreated from the Caucasus to the Don River. In the face of the incessant attacks of the Red Army, the German armies had to retreat in order to heal their wounds. Although an important place such as Kharkov was lost in this process, the withdrawal took place and the German defense line was reduced to a 1,500 kilometers line stretching from Leningrad to the north of the Black Sea. Erich von Manstein, with Army Group South, recaptured Kharkov in February after one of the biggest ground battles in modern history and stabilized the front. You can find detailed content about General Manstein's military career on our channel. In the spring of 1943, both sides were making their own attack plans. The Germans did not have a general offensive power on the whole front, but if they could use their strength well, they could continue to hold the initiative. With this in mind, the Germans aimed to hit the Kursk ledge, where more than a fifth of the Soviet troop strength was located. If this place was captured by Operation Citadel, a heavy blow would be dealt to the Red Army. The Russians and Germans prepared for the great battle that was to take place at Kursk. Germans, although they could not fully concentrate their focus due to the Allied landings in Sicily and Italy, they went on the offensive in July. In Kursk, where the biggest tank battle in history took place, the Red Army inflicted an unforgettable defeat on Wermich and all the initiative on the front passed to the Russians. The Red Army advanced rapidly, increasing the range of attack and pressure. The Germans barely held on west of the Dnieper River at the end of September. They even lost Kiev in November. The Kursk defeat also caused the Germans to completely and definitively abandon the offensive on Leningrad. 1943 marked the third phase of the war in the Pacific. After the Japanese were defeated at the Battle of Guadalcanal, they went on the defensive at almost all points. The Americans had rebounded faster than they had expected, and their economic strength was much less than that of the Washington administration. At the risk of losing some islands, they pulled back their defenses a little more and tried to gain some more time. At the end of 1943, the leaders of the Allied powers had identified three main operations for the war in Europe. The first is to land in Normandy, the second is to make a secondary landing in southern France, and the third is to take Rome and advance to the Alps. The operation in Italy turned into a disappointment, as we said a few minutes ago, and until May 1944 the Allies did not achieve the desired successes. Although Rome was captured in the attack in June, the desired distance could not be covered. 600,000 men at the front could only reach the Bologna-Ravenna line by the end of the year, with the withdrawal of the Germans from place to place. The struggle on the Italian front was not very beneficial for the Allies, except to prevent the Germans from moving troops to France. The main objective of the Allies was the landing in Normandy. They were preparing with all their might to pierce the Atlantic Wall, which is more than 2,000 kilometers long. On the other hand, the situation of the Germans waiting for the attack was not very encouraging. There was uncertainty in all matters, especially in the tactics to be applied, especially since the chain of command turned to Arab hair. In this environment, British and American troops landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, and by making good use of the mistakes made by the Germans, they managed to hold on to the beach. According to the infographic, the Allies had landed 154,465 soldiers on the first day. You can learn about the depth of defense gear and many statistics about the Normandy landings from the World War II infographic. When the Germans were mentally disintegrated by the successive changes in the upper chain of command and especially by the assassination of Hitler on June 20th, the Allies attacked from the point they were holding on to the interior of France. They gave freedom to France by losing great losses and missing great opportunities until September. When the winter of 1944 came, the situation was like on the map. Although the Western Front calmed down when winter came, the same was not true for the Eastern Front. The Germans were at a disadvantage against the Russians on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht was less in number than its enemy in terms of equipment, tanks, and guns. Resources were depleted, air superiority was completely lost. On top of that, the front line was too wide to hold. With the reinforcements they received from the Americans, the Russians launched a winter offensive from the front bulge on the Kiev side at the end of 1943. They did not retreat, they surrounded and destroyed the fighting German troops, broke the siege of Leningrad, captured the western part of Ukraine and stood on the Carpathian Mountains in May. This month, the German side had somewhat stabilized the front, but its satellites such as Finland and Romania were very keen on making peace with the Soviets. Following the Allied landing in Normandy, the Russians began the Belarusian offensive from the Pripyat marshes in late June. One of the most successful Soviet offensives took place and the Axis line was broken. The Red Army arrived until the Warsaw Leader in mid-August. Romania first surrendered and then switched sides. Subsequently, the Bulgarians surrendered to the Russian invasion and declared that they had changed sides. The Finns gave up at about the same time. The Russians of the Red Army did not stop and advanced in the autumn. They cleared the Baltic and landed on East Prussia. They descended to the Hungarian plain via the Carpathians, reached as far as Budapest and captured Belgrade together with the Slavic partisans. The southern Balkans fell into the hands of the Allies as the German forces in Greece and Yugoslavia quickly withdrew. The Russians were intent on advancing further, but when winter came the Germans rallied here as well as on the Western Front, gathering strength for the last time to put up a solid defense. German cities were working for homeland defense this time under the bombardment of Allied planes. The War of the Pacific had entered the fourth phase. By the spring of 1944, the American navies took the Gilbert, Marshall, and Caroline Islands, made critical gains in the southwestern Pacific. Thus, the first ring of the defensive circle, which the Japanese saw as vital, was broken. Accelerating in the middle of the year, the Americans took critical airports in New Guinea and the Mariana Islands, breaking through the Japanese internal defense line as well. The Mariana Islands were very important because they were the first places to attack the Philippines, China, Formosa, and Japan directly. The next destination was the Philippines. The United States attacked there in October 1944 to prevent the Japanese from reaching oil in the West Indies. As a result of the Philippines operation, where some of the bloodiest air and naval battles in world history were experienced, the Americans captured critical points. Afterwards, they headed straight for the island of Japan. The British, on the other hand, were trying to get the Japanese out of Burma by allying with the Chinese. When the winter of 1944 came, the Germans seemed to have recovered somewhat and were well organized for defense. Encouraged by this, Hitler pressed the button for an offensive aiming to break through the Allied troops on the Western Front, on the principle that attack is the best defense. The Allies were busy organizing their own attacks at the time. They were very confident that victory would come. The commanders even argued and joked among themselves about whether they could enter Berlin at Christmas. No one could have imagined that Hitler would attack France the way he had attacked France 4 years ago. But on December 16, 1944, the Germans flooded the mountainous and forested Ardennes. Seizing the chance to encircle some of the enemy, the Germans lost their offensive force upon the order of Adolf Hitler to march to Paris, who was ecstatic at this success. This also resulted in the loss of much of the power that Germany could use for defense. Although all the reports put before Hitler in 1945 pointed to the collapse, Hitler preferred to attack instead of believing them. While maintaining his Western ambitions, he was sending reinforcements to besiege Budapest. However, Stalin was considering attacking from the Vistula River line with 225 divisions. The offensive began on January 12, although even his own allies did not believe that Stalin could do such a thing. Armored corps crossing the split line spread across the Polish plain. The Germans were stunned as they did not expect this attack at all. They were only able to stop their enemies at the Oder River in mid-February, thanks to the shortening of the front line. Germany in the spring of 1945, it was open to attack from France, Poland, and Italy. Hitler put most of his forces into the Oder River so that he could stop the Soviet armies he feared so much. He was waiting for a miracle to save them. He was willing to resist at all costs, since he sincerely believed that if he saved the war, the German people would be destroyed as well. Of course, the unconditional surrender of the Allies had an effect on his attitude. Allied forces in the West attacked the Rhine in early March. At the end of the month, when they crossed the river, there was no obstacle in front of them. In April, they started a run towards Berlin. Realizing that they had been defeated, the German people preferred the Americans or the British to enter Berlin rather than the Russians. On April 11th, the Allies penetrated 100 kilometers into Berlin. The Russians also took the offensive in March. Although they were successful on the flanks, they could not break the defense in the Oder for a long time. On April 16th, they increased the violence and collapsed the defense. In the ambition to reach Berlin before the Americans, they headed west. On April 25th, they completely isolated the city. On 27 Nisa, they met with the Allied forces on the Elbe River. After this point, many German troops surrendered. But Hitler continued the war from the suburbs of Berlin. When he lost all hope, he committed suicide on April 30th. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8 following his death. 1945 was also the last year of the war in the Pacific. Having captured key points in the Philippines, the Americans were determined to stab a dagger directly into the heart of the enemy to disable the Empire of Japan, which would not survive if it could not resupply. For this, the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were seen as stepping stones. While the airstrikes on Tokyo continued, the attack on the island of Iwo began in mid-February. But the island resisted more than expected and was captured only at the end of March. Okinawa was next. On April 1st, the battle began. In the battle that would determine the fate of the front, the Americans suffered great losses and took the parts of the island that would be useful to them, if not the whole island. After a short time in southwest China, Burma would also fall into the hands of the Allies. In the second half of the year, the Americans pressed the button for a relentless air attack through the islands they captured. Most of the Japanese cities, especially Tokyo, groaned under the bombs. The desire for peace among the Japanese people was increasing day by day, but despite this, they continued their strict defenses. Although they demanded peace, their pride and hope kept them from surrendering unconditionally. The Americans were trying to end the war before the Soviets turned their focus to the Pacific. Landing on the island of Japan would have caused huge losses, but they knew they had to end the war as well. So they dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6 to speed up the Japanese surrender. 3 days later, an atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives when the bombs fell on the cities. Although the effect of the bombs was not well understood at that time, it did not speed up the surrender, but when the Soviets declared war, the Japanese plunged into complete despair. The Japanese emperor announced his surrender on August 14th. With the documents signed on September 2nd, the surrender became official. In this way, World War II ended on September 2, 1945, 6 years and 1 day after it started.